Her name was Emma Carter. 26 years old. A nurse in training, kind-hearted, the kind of person who always stopped when everyone else drove past. His name, though she didn't know it yet, was Daniel Harrison. A wealthy businessman from New York. Sharp, guarded, and running from something no one alive was supposed to know about. Two strangers. One freezing morning. And a secret that had been sleeping for 20 years, waiting for someone brave enough to wake it up. This is their story. The morning Emma Carter's life changed forever started like every other morning, gray, cold, and unremarkable. Chicago in early winter had a way of making everything feel muted. The sky hung low and colorless above the skyline, and a thin mist clung to the streets, blurring the edges of buildings like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Emma had worked a 12-hour shift the night before, the kind that left her feeling hollowed out, her eyes burning from fluorescent light and endless charts. She just wanted to get home, shower, and sleep for as long as her body would let her. She turned down a side street to avoid the morning traffic, a shortcut she rarely used. It ran past an old parking lot, mostly empty, fenced on one side by a row of leafless trees. She almost didn't notice him. At first, she thought it was a pile of discarded clothing. Then she saw the shape of a shoulder, an arm bent at a strange angle, dark fabric soaked through in a way that clothing left in the rain simply doesn't get soaked. She slowed the car. Something in her chest tightened before her mind had even caught up. She pulled over. Emma had been trained to notice things other people missed, small signs, subtle changes, the kind of details you learn to read when you spend your days around people who are suffering and trying to hide it. She noticed the stillness of him first. Then the blood. Then the suit, expensive, tailored, utterly wrong for a man lying in the dirt beside a dumpster. She didn't think. She acted. Her door was open before she'd even put the car in park completely. She ran to him, her knees hitting the cold, wet pavement without hesitation, her hands already moving to his neck to check for a pulse. It was there, faint, uneven, but there. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" No response. His face was pale, almost gray, and there was a gash along his hairline that had bled down the side of his face and dried in dark streaks. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed 911, her voice steadier than she felt as she gave the dispatcher the location, the details, the urgency in clipped, practiced sentences. "Please send an ambulance now. He's unconscious, there's significant blood loss, I don't know how long he's been here." She stayed on the line as instructed, kneeling beside him, one hand pressed gently against the wound at his hairline, applying what pressure she could with the sleeve of her jacket. The dispatcher's voice buzzed faintly through the speaker, asking questions, walking her through what to check. But Emma's attention was on the man in front of her, on the way his breathing hitched, shallow and uneven, like his body wasn't sure it wanted to keep going. Then, without warning, his eyes opened. Just for a second. Just long enough for Emma's breath to catch in her throat. His eyes were dark, unfocused, glassy with pain and blood loss. But there was something in them, a flicker of awareness, a desperate clarity that cut through the haze. "I'm here," she whispered back, gripping his hand without thinking. "I'm not going anywhere. Just stay with me too, okay?" His lips moved again. She leaned closer, straining to hear. "Don't let them find me." And then his eyes rolled back, and he was gone again, not dead, but somewhere far away, somewhere Emma couldn't follow. She stayed frozen for a moment, his words echoing strangely in her mind. "Don't let them find me." Who was them? Find him for what? Was someone still out there, still looking for this man, still wanting to finish whatever had been started in that empty parking lot? The sound of sirens in the distance pulled her back to the present. She kept her hand pressed to his wound, kept talking to him in a low, steady voice even though he couldn't hear her anymore, the way she'd been taught, because sometimes, some part of a person is still listening, even in the dark. The paramedics arrived in a blur of red and white lights, and suddenly there were hands other than hers on him, voices calling out vitals, a stretcher, the sound of a gurney's wheels clattering against the uneven pavement. Emma stood back, suddenly aware of how cold she was, how badly her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was starting to fade. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" one of the paramedics asked her, glancing at the blood on her hands and jacket. "No, it's not mine. I just found him. I don't know him." "Ma'am, are you hurt?" one of the paramedics asked her, glancing at the blood on her hands and jacket. No, it's not mine. I just found him. I don't know him." The paramedic nodded, already turning back to the stretcher. "You did good. You probably saved his life. That blood loss, another 20 minutes out here and it would have been a different story." Emma watched them load him into the ambulance, watched the doors close, watched the vehicle pull away with its siren rising into the gray morning air. And then she was alone again, standing in an empty parking lot, staring at a dark stain on the pavement where a stranger had almost died. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why someone had hurt him. She didn't know that in less than 48 hours, her entire understanding of her family would come apart at the seams. She followed the ambulance to the hospital. She told herself it was just to make sure he was okay, that it was the responsible thing to do, the kind of loose end a person needed to tie up before they could really let themselves rest. But if she was honest with herself, it was something else too, a pull she couldn't quite explain. Those 4 words kept circling in her mind like a record stuck on repeat. "Don't let them find me." She sat in the waiting room for hours. The chairs were the uncomfortable kind, molded plastic bolted to metal frames, and the air smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. She watched the clock on the wall crawl forward, watched other people come and go, watched a woman cry quietly into her hands in the corner and a father pace back and forth with a fussing toddler on his hip. Finally, just after noon, a doctor in blue scrubs approached her. "Are you the one who called it in? The man from the parking lot?" Emma stood quickly. "Yes." Is he going to be okay?" The doctor's expression softened, just slightly. "He's stable. It was close, he lost a lot of blood, and there was some internal bleeding we had to address in surgery, but he's going to make it. You probably saved his life, showing up when you did." Relief washed over Emma so suddenly that her knees felt weak. She hadn't realized how much tension she'd been carrying until it started to drain away. "Can I see him?" The doctor shook his head gently. "Not today. He needs rest, and honestly, he's not going to be very responsive for a while yet. Come back tomorrow, if you'd like." Emma nodded, thanked him, and made her way back out into the cold afternoon light. She should have felt satisfied. She had done what she set out to do. She'd made sure the stranger was alive, made sure he was in good hands. There was no reason for her to go back. And yet she knew, with a strange and quiet certainty, that she would. She returned the next afternoon, carrying a small bouquet of flowers she'd picked up from a shop near her apartment, feeling a little foolish about it the whole drive over. What did you bring a stranger you'd found half dead in a parking lot? Was this normal? Was this something people did? She found his room on the 3rd floor, the door slightly ajar. She knocked softly and pushed it open. He was awake. He looked different than she remembered from the parking lot, cleaned up now, dressed in a hospital gown instead of a ruined suit, and 4 taped to the back of his hand, a bandage wrapped neatly around his head. But his eyes were sharp now, alert in a way that startled her a little. And when he saw her standing in the doorway, something shifted in his expression, something between recognition and alarm. "You," he said. "Hi," Emma said, feeling suddenly awkward, the flowers clutched a little too tightly in her hand. "I'm Emma. I'm the one who, well, I found you. I just wanted to see how you were doing." He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes searching her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces to. "Why did you save me?" he finally asked. The question caught her off guard. Because you needed help. Isn't that reason enough? Something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked almost like guilt. He looked away from her, toward the window, toward the gray Chicago skyline beyond the glass. You shouldn't have, he said quietly. Emma frowned, setting the flowers down on the small table beside his bed without really thinking about it. Why would you say that? I'm glad I stopped. You could have died out there. You don't understand, he murmured, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that made Emma's chest ache in a way she couldn't explain. Some things are better left alone. Before she could respond, his phone, sitting on the tray table beside the bed, began to buzz. He glanced at the screen, and Emma watched his entire face change. The guarded sadness vanished, replaced instantly by something colder, harder. Fear, dressed up as control. He reached over and rejected the call without answering it, his jaw clenched so tight Emma could see the muscle working beneath his skin. Who was that? She asked carefully. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to look at her, and his voice, when it came, was low and urgent. Listen to me. You need to forget you ever met me. Whatever happened here, whatever you saw, it's not your business, and it's not safe for you to make it your business. Do you understand? Emma felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. What happened to you? Who did this? I can't tell you. Then why were you attacked? Why would someone leave you to die in a parking lot? He said nothing. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than any answer could have been. Emma stood there for a long moment, waiting, hoping he'd say something, anything, that would make sense of the fear she'd seen cross his face, the desperation in his voice when he'd begged her not to let them find him. But he gave her nothing. He just stared past her, toward the window, toward whatever storm was raging behind his eyes that he refused to let her see. Finally, she picked up her purse. Okay, she said softly. I hope you feel better. She left the room without looking back, but she could feel his eyes on her the entire way out. She drove home that evening with a strange, uneasy feeling settled deep in her stomach, the kind of feeling that told her something important had just brushed past her, close enough to touch, and she hadn't understood what it was. She told herself it wasn't her problem. She told herself she'd done her part, that she'd saved a man's life, and whatever secrets he was carrying were his to keep. She told herself all of this as she made dinner, as she got ready for bed, as she tried and failed to fall asleep, that stranger's face floating behind her closed eyes. Don't let them find me. You shouldn't have. Forget you ever met me. None of it made sense. And yet somewhere, quietly, in a part of her mind she wasn't paying attention to, the pieces were already beginning to shift. Her phone rang just after 7 the next morning, pulling her from a restless, shallow sleep. She answered without checking the screen, her voice still thick with sleep. Hello? Emma. Her grandmother's voice, but not the voice Emma knew. Not warm, not steady. This was a voice tight with something Emma had never heard in it before. Fear, maybe. Or grief reopened. Grandma? What's wrong? Come home. Right now. Please, Emma, come home immediately. What's going on? Are you okay? Is it your heart? Should I call? I'm fine, her grandmother said, cutting her off, though her voice shook as she said it. Just, please. Come home. I need to show you something. The line went dead before Emma could ask anything else. She sat frozen on the edge of her bed for a moment, phone still pressed to her ear, that same uneasy feeling from the day before rising up again, stronger now, sharper. Something about her grandmother's voice had unsettled her in a way she couldn't name. In 26 years, she had never once heard her grandmother sound afraid. She dressed quickly, grabbed her keys, and drove the 40 minutes to her family's house on autopilot, her mind spinning through every possibility, an illness, an accident, bad news about a relative she hadn't thought about in years. Nothing prepared her for what she found when she walked through the front door. The dining table, usually set with her grandmother's careful, old-fashioned place settings, was instead covered in papers, old documents, yellowed at the edges, photographs faded with time, a few newspaper clippings so brittle they looked like they might crumble if touched. Her grandmother sat at the head of the table, her hands trembling as she held a single photograph, staring at it like it might disappear if she looked away. "Grandma?" Emma said softly, stepping into the room. "What is all this?" Her grandmother looked up, and Emma saw that her eyes were red, swollen from crying, though she was composed now, sitting up straight, her chin lifted in that familiar, stubborn way Emma had known her whole life. "Sit down, sweetheart." Emma sat. Her grandmother was quiet for a long moment, turning the photograph over in her hands, before she finally spoke. "Do you remember your Uncle Daniel?" Emma blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Uncle Daniel? I mean, not really. I was so young. I thought he died before I was even 5. Dad never really talked about him." Her grandmother's hands tightened around the photograph. "He didn't die." Emma felt something cold settle in her chest. "What do you mean he didn't die?" "We had a memorial for him. I remember the picture of him in the hallway, the one with the black ribbon on it." "He disappeared," her grandmother said, her voice cracking slightly on the word. 20 years ago. He was 30 years old, and one day he simply vanished. No note. No warning. We searched everywhere, Emma. We hired investigators. We contacted every hospital, every police department, every morgue within 500 miles. Years went by. Eventually, we had no choice but to believe he was gone. Your grandfather, God rest him, never stopped hoping, right up until the day he died. He used to say Daniel would come home someday. I stopped believing that a long time ago." Emma's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was hearing, trying to understand why her grandmother was telling her this now, today, with such urgency in her voice. "Grandma, why are you telling me this now?" Her grandmother slowly turned the photograph around and slid it across the table toward Emma. It showed 2 young men standing side by side in front of an old brick building, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, both of them dressed in the kind of stiff, formal clothes people wore for special occasions decades ago. One of the men, Emma recognized instantly. It was her father, younger than she'd ever seen him, his smile wide and unguarded in a way she rarely saw anymore. The other man, she also recognized. She just didn't understand how that was possible. Because standing there in that old, faded photograph, laughing, alive, decades younger, was the exact same face she had knelt beside on a cold Chicago morning, the same face she had watched go pale and still in the back of an ambulance, the same face that had looked at her from a hospital bed and told her to forget she'd ever seen him. "That's him," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Grandma, that's him. That's the man I found." Her grandmother's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" 2 days ago, Emma said, her hands starting to shake now, the photograph trembling between her fingers. "I found a man bleeding in a parking lot on my way home from my shift. I called an ambulance. I've been to see him twice at the hospital. His name is Daniel Harrison. He said he's a businessman from New York." The color drained from her grandmother's face. "Daniel Harrison," her grandmother repeated slowly, as if testing the name, as if trying to understand how the boy in that photograph and the name Emma had just spoken could possibly be the same person. "Emma. Daniel Harrison is your uncle." The room seemed to tilt around her. Emma stared down at the photograph in her hands, at the young man's easy smile, at the family resemblance she could suddenly see so clearly now that she knew to look for it, the same set of the jaw as her father, the same dark, serious eyes. 20 years. Her family had searched for this man for 20 years, had mourned him, had built an entire history around his absence, and Emma had found him bleeding in a parking lot without even knowing his name, had sat beside his hospital bed, had looked into the very eyes her grandmother had spent 2 decades hoping to see again. And somewhere out there, someone had tried to make sure he never made it home. Someone had wanted Daniel Harrison to disappear all over again, permanently, this time. Emma looked up at her grandmother, her heart pounding, 1,000 questions crowding her throat all at once. "Grandma," she whispered. "Why did he disappear? And why is someone trying to kill him now, after 20 years? Her grandmother didn't have an answer. But somewhere across the city, in a hospital room with the blinds drawn and his phone turned face down on the table, Daniel Harrison did. And the truth he was hiding was about to bring everything: the family he'd left behind, the danger he'd been running from, and the niece who had unknowingly saved his life twice, crashing together in. Emma Carter saved a dying stranger on a cold Chicago morning. That stranger turned out to be Daniel Harrison, her uncle, missing for 20 years, believed dead by everyone who loved him. Now Emma knows the truth. But Daniel doesn't know that she knows. And somewhere out there, the person who tried to kill him isn't finished yet. Emma sat at her grandmother's dining table for a long time after the truth settled over her, staring down at the photograph until the edges of it blurred in her vision. Her uncle. The man in the hospital bed, the man who had begged a stranger not to let them find him, was her father's brother. Her own blood. And she had knelt beside him in the dirt of a parking lot without knowing it, had held his hand while he slipped in and out of consciousness, had no idea that the stranger's life she was fighting to save was tied to her own by something deeper than chance. "Grandma," she said quietly, still staring at the photograph, "I need to know everything. Why did he leave? What happened to him?" Her grandmother's hands, folded tightly on the table, trembled slightly. She looked older in that moment than Emma had ever seen her, not fragile, exactly, but weighed down, like the years of grief she'd carried had finally caught up all at once. "I don't know everything," she admitted. "Daniel never told us why he left. One day he was here, running the family business with your father, full of plans for the future. The next day, he was simply gone. No note. No phone call. We searched everywhere, Emma. Detectives. Newspapers. We even offered a reward for information, though we tried to keep that quiet. Your grandfather didn't want anyone thinking there was money to be made off our pain. And nothing? No leads at all?" Her grandmother shook her head slowly. "Nothing that made sense. A few false sightings over the years, people who thought they recognized him in another city, but they always led nowhere. Eventually, your grandfather had to accept, we all had to accept, that Daniel was gone. Whether he'd chosen to disappear, or whether something terrible had happened to him, we never knew. We just knew he wasn't coming back." Emma looked down at the photograph again, at the easy, unguarded laughter frozen on her uncle's young face, and felt something twist painfully in her chest. Whatever had made that laughing young man disappear, whatever secret had been heavy enough to make him walk away from his entire family without a word, it had to be something enormous. Something dangerous enough that even now, 20 years later, someone had tried to kill him rather than let him come home. "I have to go back," Emma said, standing abruptly. "I have to talk to him. He needs to know that we know. He needs to come home, Grandma." Her grandmother reached out and caught her hand before she could leave, her grip surprisingly strong. "Emma. Be careful. If someone hurt him badly enough to nearly kill him, they may still be looking for him. You could be putting yourself in danger too." Emma squeezed her grandmother's hand gently. "I already found him once. I'm not going to let him disappear again, not without at least trying to bring him home." The drive back to the hospital felt longer than it had any right to be. Emma's mind raced the entire way, replaying every strange detail from the past 2 days, Daniel's fear when his phone rang, the way his whole body had gone rigid at the sound of it, the desperation in his voice when he told her to forget she ever met him. None of it had made sense before. Now, knowing what she knew, it made a terrible kind of sense. He wasn't just protecting a secret. He was protecting his family, the same family that had spent 20 years searching for him, not knowing that his absence was, in some way, meant to keep them safe. She parked in the hospital garage and walked quickly toward the entrance, the photograph tucked carefully into her bag, her heart pounding with something that felt like both fear and determination. She had no idea what she was about to say to him, no idea how he would react to learning that his secret was already out, but she knew she couldn't walk away and pretend none of this had happened. Not now. Not when she understood exactly who he was to her. When she reached his floor, something felt different immediately. A police officer stood near the nurse's station, speaking in low tones with one of the doctors. Emma's stomach dropped. "Excuse me," she said, approaching cautiously. "I'm here to see Daniel Harrison, room 314. Is everything okay?" The doctor turned to her, his expression careful, measured. "Are you family?" "Yes," Emma said, the word feeling strange and new in her mouth. "He's my uncle." The doctor exchanged a glance with the officer before answering. "There was an incident a few hours ago. Someone attempted to access his room using falsified hospital credentials, claimed to be a specialist called in for consultation. A nurse became suspicious and called security before anything happened. Mr. Harrison is fine, physically. But given the circumstances, we've moved him to a more secure part of the hospital, and the police have been notified." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "Someone tried to get to him? Here? In the hospital?" "We believe so, yes," the officer said grimly. "Which is why, if you're family, we'll need to speak with you as well. Anything you can tell us about Mr. Harrison, about who might want to harm him, could be helpful." Emma's mind spun. 20 years of silence, and now, the moment Daniel had finally been found, the moment he'd been vulnerable enough for someone to reach him, his enemies had come looking almost immediately. It couldn't be a coincidence. Someone had to be watching. Someone had to have known he was here. "Can I see him?" she asked, her voice tighter than she meant it to be. The doctor nodded. "Briefly. He's been asking for you, actually, though I should warn you, he's shaken. Whatever happened here today, it clearly frightened him badly." They led her down a different hallway, past a checkpoint where her ID was verified and logged, to a room with a security guard stationed just outside the door. When Emma stepped inside, she found Daniel sitting upright in the hospital bed, his face pale, his hands folded tightly in his lap in a way that reminded her, suddenly and painfully, of her grandmother sitting at that dining table just hours before. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "You heard," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Someone tried to get to you," Emma said, moving to sit in the chair beside his bed. "Daniel," she hesitated over the name, feeling the strangeness of it, the weight of everything it now meant. "I know who you are. I know you're my uncle." Whatever composure he had left seemed to crack at that. He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. "How?" he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "How did you find out?" "My grandmother," Emma said gently. "She showed me an old photograph. The moment I saw it, I knew. It was you and my father, years ago, before," she stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Before I disappeared," Daniel finished quietly. He opened his eyes, and Emma was startled to see they were wet with unshed tears. "I never wanted any of you to find me like this. Not hurt. Not like a stranger you had to save in a parking lot." "Then tell me why," Emma said, leaning forward. "Tell me why you left. Tell me who's trying to kill you, 20 years later. I need to understand, Daniel. My whole family needs to understand." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands, at the 4 taped to the back of one of them, at the faint bruising along his knuckles that Emma hadn't noticed before, the marks of a struggle, evidence of whatever had happened to him before she found him in that parking lot. 20 years ago, he began slowly, I was running the family company with your father. We'd built it together, from nothing, the two of us, you know that part already, I'm sure. What you don't know is that a few months before I disappeared, I discovered that my business partner, a man named Richard Voss, someone I trusted completely, someone I considered a friend, had been stealing from the company. Not small amounts, Emma. Millions. He'd been funneling money through shell accounts for years, hiding it well enough that even our accountants hadn't caught it. Emma listened, her heart pounding, as the pieces of a 20-year-old mystery began, finally, to take shape. I confronted him, Daniel continued. I told him I was going to expose it, to the board, to the authorities, all of it. I thought he'd panic. I thought he'd try to negotiate, maybe offer to pay it back quietly. I didn't expect what he actually did. Daniel's voice dropped lower, rougher. He came to my house that night. He told me that if I went to the authorities, if I said one word about what I'd found, he'd make sure my family paid for it. Not financially, Emma. He meant it literally. He had people, dangerous people, people I didn't even know he was connected to. He named names. He named your father. He named my parents. He even mentioned you, though you were just a baby then. Emma felt sick. So you disappeared. To protect us. I thought it was the only way, Daniel said, his voice breaking now. I thought if I vanished, if Richard believed I was gone, out of the picture, unable to expose him, he'd leave the rest of you alone. I couldn't go to the police. I had no real proof yet, nothing that would hold up, and I was terrified that if I thought it was the only way, Daniel said, his voice breaking now. I thought if I vanished, if Richard believed I was gone, out of the picture, unable to expose him, he'd leave the rest of you alone. I couldn't go to the police. I had no real proof yet, nothing that would hold up, and I was terrified that if I tried and failed, he'd carry out his threats before I could stop him. So I ran. I left everything behind, my name, my family, my entire life, and I built a new one, far enough away that I thought he'd never find me again. For 20 years? Emma whispered. For 20 years, Daniel confirmed, tears finally spilling over now, tracking silently down his face. I told myself it was worth it. I told myself you were all safer without me. I missed my parents' funerals, Emma. I missed your father's wedding. I missed you growing up. I built an entire life in the shadows, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the day Richard would find me anyway. He let out a broken, humorless laugh. And in the end, he did. A few weeks ago, I found out he'd finally traced me here, to Chicago. I panicked. I tried to run again, tried to disappear before he could reach me. That's how I ended up in that parking lot. He found me first. Emma reached out and took his hand, the same hand she'd held that first cold morning, though this time she understood exactly what she was holding on to. You spent 20 years protecting us, she said softly, and you never let yourself come home even when it was safe to. Daniel, we never stopped looking for you. My grandmother has spent 2 decades grieving a man who was still alive. My father lost his brother and never understood why. Daniel shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought coming back would put you all in danger again. I thought disappearing was protecting you. Emma squeezed his hand. Sometimes running away doesn't protect the people you love. Sometimes it just makes everyone lose you twice. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Outside the door, the security guard shifted his weight, and somewhere down the hall a machine beeped steadily, indifferent to the 20 years of grief and fear finally being laid bare in that small room. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice steadier now, though still thick with emotion. There's something else you should know. Something that might actually help us end this, finally, after all this time. Emma looked up at him. What is it? A few months ago, Daniel said, before Richard found me, I started gathering proof. Bank records. Old emails I'd kept copies of, from before I disappeared. Testimony from a former employee who reached out to me, someone who'd seen enough over the years to know something was wrong. I have enough now, Emma, enough to actually put him away this time. That's why he's so desperate to stop me. It's not just that I know his secret anymore. It's that I can finally prove it. Emma felt a spark of something fierce and protective rise up in her chest. Then we go to the police. Together. We end this. Daniel hesitated, old fear still flickering behind his eyes. It's not that simple. Richard has resources, connections. People who owe him favors, people who are afraid of him. If we move against him and it goes wrong, then we don't let it go wrong, Emma said firmly. You're not alone anymore, Daniel. You have family now. You have people who will stand beside you, who will fight for you, the way you tried to protect us for 20 years. Let us help you finish this. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, the faint, fragile beginning of hope, the kind he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 2 decades. Your grandmother, he said quietly. Does she know? About all of it? About Richard, about why I really left? Not yet, Emma admitted. But she deserves to know. She's spent 20 years believing you might just be dead somewhere, with no answers at all. Knowing the truth, even a painful truth, has to be better than that silence. Daniel nodded slowly, wiping at his face with the back of his uninjured hand. Then I need to see her. All of them. My whole family. I've hidden from this long enough. Just as Emma opened her mouth to respond, the door to the room swung open sharply, and the police officer from the hallway stepped inside, his expression tense. Mr. Harrison. Miss Carter. I need you both to listen carefully. He glanced back over his shoulder before continuing, lowering his voice. We've identified the man who tried to access this room earlier. Facial recognition matched him to a security guard employed by a company with ties to Richard Voss's corporation. Given what you've both just told me through the door, and I apologize, I couldn't help but overhear some of it, I think it's clear that Mr. Voss knows exactly where you are, and he's not going to stop trying. Emma's heart pounded as she looked between the officer and her uncle, the fragile hope from moments before suddenly tangled up with fresh fear. What do we do? She asked. The officer's expression was grim. We need to move quickly. If Mr. Harrison truly has the evidence he claims to have, we need to secure it immediately, before anyone else can get to it, or to him. And Miss Carter, he added, turning to her, his voice softening slightly with warning, given that Voss's people now know you're connected to Mr. Harrison, you need to understand, you may be a target too. The room went silent. Emma looked down at Daniel, at the fear and guilt already rising in his expression, the same fear that had driven him away from his family 20 years ago threatening to consume him all over again. No, Emma said firmly, more to Daniel than to the officer, gripping his hand tighter. I'm not running. Not this time. Not any of us. Daniel looked up at her, something breaking and mending in his expression all at once. 20 years of guilt, 20 years of loneliness, 20 years of believing that loving his family meant staying away from them, finally beginning to give way to something else entirely. Hope. Fragile, frightened, but real. But hope, Emma was about to learn, would not come without one final, dangerous confrontation, a confrontation that would force Daniel to finally face the man who had stolen 20 years of his life, and force Emma to decide exactly how far she was willing to go to protect the family she had only just discovered was hers. Will Daniel finally bring Richard Voss to justice? Will Emma's family survive the danger that follows them home? And after 20 years apart, will Daniel finally find his way back, not just to his family's house, but to the place he truly belongs? 20 years of hiding. 20 years of silence. 20 years of a family grieving a man who was still alive, just out of reach. It all comes to an end today. But before Daniel Harrison can finally go home, he has to face the one man who took everything from him, the man who is still willing to do anything to keep the truth buried forever. This is the final part of the story that started with a stranger, bleeding, alone in a parking lot. Stay until the very end. Because what happens next will remind you why some bonds can survive 20 years of silence, and why coming home is always worth the risk. Short recap, 020. Daniel Harrison vanished 20 years ago to protect his family from a dangerous business partner, Richard Voss. Emma Carter, his niece, found him bleeding in a parking lot without knowing who he was, and then found out he was the uncle her family had mourned for 2 decades. Now Voss knows Daniel is alive. And he will do anything to stop him from telling the truth. The hospital room felt smaller with the officer standing in it, his words hanging heavy in the air. You may be a target too. Emma had heard those words spoken about other people before, on the news, in stories that always felt far away, happening to someone else. She had never imagined she would hear them spoken about herself, in a quiet hospital room, holding the hand of an uncle she had known for exactly 2 days. But strangely, underneath the fear, something else was rising in her, something steady and certain. She was not going to let this family lose Daniel a second time. Officer, she said, her voice calm despite the pounding of her heart, what do we need to do to end this? Really end it. Not just protect ourselves for today, but make sure Richard Voss can never do this to anyone again. The officer studied her for a moment, then looked to Daniel. Mr. Harrison, you mentioned you have evidence. Bank records, correspondence, witness testimony. Where is it now? Daniel's hand tightened slightly around Emma's. Safe. A storage facility under a name Voss doesn't know. I was on my way there when I was attacked. I think he suspected I was building a case, but he didn't know how much I already had, or where I was keeping it. Then that's our first priority, the officer said. We get that evidence secured and into the hands of the district attorney's office before Voss can find it or destroy it. Once it's out of your hands and into the system, Mr. Harrison, you're no longer the only obstacle standing between him and exposure. That changes everything. Right now, you're a target because you're the only person who can bring him down. Once that evidence is filed, it won't matter what happens to you, the truth will already be out there. Daniel let out a long breath, some of the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since Emma had walked into that room. Then let's do it. Let's finish this. It took 2 more days to move everything into place, 2 days that felt to Emma like the longest of her life. Daniel was discharged from the hospital under careful watch, moved to a secure location while investigators quietly began building their case, following the trail of evidence he had spent months gathering. Emma spent those days shuttling between her own apartment, her grandmother's house, and the safe house where Daniel was staying, trying to process the sheer size of everything that had happened in less than a week. Her grandmother had cried for nearly an hour when Emma finally brought her to see Daniel, the two of them embracing in a way that seemed to fold 20 years of grief and love into a single, trembling moment. Emma had stood in the doorway, watching, and felt something in her own chest crack open, a kind of tenderness she hadn't expected to feel this deeply for a man she had only just met. Her father, when he found out, had driven 3 hours through the night to see his brother, and the reunion between them had been quieter, heavier, full of the kind of silence that only decades of loss could create. Emma watched her father, a man she had only ever seen calm, composed, in control, break down completely in his brother's arms, both of them apologizing for things that were never really their fault, both of them simply grateful, in the end, to be standing in the same room again. It was in watching these reunions, these fragile, imperfect, beautiful moments of a family finding its way back to wholeness, that Emma began to understand something important. Daniel hadn't disappeared because he stopped loving his family. He had disappeared because he loved them so much that he was willing to give up everything, his name, his home, 20 years of his life, just to keep them safe. It hadn't been abandonment. It had been sacrifice, carried alone and in silence for 2 decades, because he believed there was no other way. And Emma understood, too, that sometimes the people who love us hardest are the ones who make choices that look, from the outside, like leaving, when really, they are trying, in whatever broken way they know how, to protect the very people they're walking away from. The confrontation with Richard Voss did not happen the way Emma had imagined it. There was no dramatic showdown, no final desperate act of violence. In the end, it happened quietly, almost anticlimactically, in a way that Emma would later realize was its own kind of justice, the truth simply outlasting the lie, the way it usually does if you give it enough time. Once Daniel's evidence was filed with the district attorney's office, investigators moved quickly. The bank records showed a clear, undeniable pattern of embezzlement stretching back over 2 decades. The old emails, carefully preserved, revealed conversations that made Voss's intentions unmistakable. And the former employee who had reached out to Daniel months earlier agreed to testify, describing threats and intimidation she had witnessed firsthand, corroborating everything Daniel had said. Richard Voss was arrested on a Tuesday morning, quietly, without incident, at the same downtown office building where he had once sat across a desk from Daniel and threatened to destroy his entire family. Emma read about it first in a news alert on her phone, sitting in her car outside the hospital where she still worked her shifts, and felt a wave of relief so overwhelming that she had to sit there for several minutes before she trusted herself to drive. It was over. 20 years of hiding, 20 years of fear, 20 years of a family grieving a man who had never actually died, it was finally, truly over. Weeks passed. The initial chaos of arrests, statements, and legal proceedings gradually gave way to something quieter, something Emma hadn't realized she'd been waiting for without knowing it: normal life, slowly rebuilding itself around a family that had been broken for 2 decades. Daniel moved back to Chicago permanently, choosing to stay close to the family he had spent so long protecting from a distance. He started rebuilding his life piece by piece, reconnecting with old friends who remembered him, slowly stepping back into a version of the business world he had once loved, though this time with the added weight and wisdom of everything he had survived. He visited his mother's grave for the first time in 20 years, and Emma's father told her later that Daniel had stood there for nearly an hour, simply talking, the way you might talk to someone you'd been carrying a lifetime of unspoken words for. Emma visited him often in those early weeks, drawn by a bond that had formed strangely and suddenly, born out of crisis but growing into something real and lasting. She would stop by his new apartment after her shifts, sometimes bringing takeout, sometimes just sitting with him while he worked through old memories, old grief, the slow process of learning how to be part of a family again after so long spent alone. One evening, several months after that cold morning in the parking lot, Emma visited Daniel at his new office, a modest space downtown, nothing like the sprawling corporate headquarters he'd once run, but his own, built from the ground up with the same quiet determination that had carried him through 2 decades in hiding. He looked different now, she thought, settling into the chair across from his desk. Lighter, somehow. The guardedness that had colored every one of their early conversations had softened into something warmer, something closer to peace. "You saved my life twice, you know," Daniel said, smiling at her in a way that reminded her, painfully and beautifully, of the young man in that old photograph, laughing beside her father, decades before either of their lives had been torn apart. Emma laughed. "How do you figure that?" "First, in that parking lot," Daniel said. "If you hadn't stopped, if you'd driven past like everyone else that morning." He paused, letting the thought hang unfinished between them. "And then again, when you refused to let me disappear back into hiding. When you told me that family was worth the risk. That's the second time you saved me, Emma. Maybe the more important one." Emma felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she smiled through it. "I guess family has a way of finding you," she said softly, "even when you spend 20 years trying to make sure they don't." Daniel looked out the window, toward the Chicago skyline stretching gray and gold in the fading evening light, the same skyline that had watched him disappear 20 years ago, now watching him finally, truly come home. "For 20 years, he said quietly, "I believed that disappearing was the only way to protect the people I loved. I thought that if I just stayed away, stayed hidden, stayed silent, I could keep you all safe from something I never should have had to face alone in the first place." He turned back to look at her, his eyes bright with something that was no longer just grief. "But I understand now that I was wrong. Running away doesn't protect the people you love, Emma. It just means you lose them, slowly, one missed moment at a time, birthdays, weddings, funerals, ordinary Tuesday afternoons you can never get back. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't running. It's staying. It's coming home, even when it's frightening, even when you're not sure you'll be forgiven." Emma reached across the desk and took his hand, the same gesture that had connected them from the very beginning, first in a parking lot, between a stranger and the woman who refused to leave him there alone, and now between an uncle and the niece who had brought him home. "You were forgiven the moment you walked through that door," she said gently. "None of us needed an apology, Daniel. We just needed you back." There is something quietly powerful in stories like this one, stories that remind us that the people we've lost aren't always gone the way we think they are, that sometimes the family we're missing is closer than we realize, waiting for someone brave enough to stop, to notice, to reach out a hand in the cold. Emma never planned to become the reason her family healed after 20 years of unanswered questions. She was just a tired nurse driving home after a long shift, the kind of ordinary person who, on any other morning, might have driven past without a second glance. But she stopped. She chose to see someone else's pain instead of looking away from it, and in doing so, she gave her entire family something they had stopped believing was possible, a homecoming they had spent 2 decades grieving they would never get. Maybe that is the real heart of this story, not the mystery, not the danger, not even the 20 years of secrets finally brought into the light. Maybe it's simply this, that kindness, offered freely and without expectation, has a way of finding its way back to us in the most unexpected forms. That the smallest choices we make, stopping the car, making the phone call, refusing to look away, can ripple outward in ways we could never predict, reaching further than we ever imagined possible. Daniel spent 20 years believing that the people who loved him would be safer without him in their lives. He was wrong. Love, real love, is not something that keeps us safer by its absence. It grows stronger the more it is given room to exist, even through pain, even through distance, even through 20 long years of silence. And somewhere in Chicago, in a modest office downtown, a man who once believed he had lost his family forever now spends his evenings surrounded by them again, his mother's memory honored, his brother's forgiveness given freely, and a niece beside him who reminds him, every single day, that sometimes the family we think we've lost is simply waiting for us to come home. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own family, your own reasons to hold on a little tighter to the people you love, stay close. There are more stories like this one still to come, stories about the quiet, powerful, sometimes messy ways that love finds its way back to us, even after everything. Because sometimes, the bravest thing any of us can do, is simply choose to come home.